Alright, in today's video we have some updates in regards to those two pieces of DLC for Final Fantasy XVI, who and what they will be focusing on for it, some quick little blurbs in regards to Crisis Core and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, as well as an update to the future of the Resident Evil franchise. So if any of that sounds cool to you, feel free to click the like button, and if you're new here and you'd like to stick around, you can subscribe as well. It's always appreciated. Before we get to today's article, you can check out my most recent video where I go over my personal hopes and predictions for this year's Game Awards events. I'm hoping again that Tifa can somehow make her way into Tekken 8. It just needs to happen. Why it hasn't happened yet, I don't know, but hopefully that will take place. And of course, when you check out that video, leave your own hopes and predictions in the comments down below on what you personally want to see at this year's event for the Game Awards. Now, getting to this article, this comes to us from Game Watch, and in it they got to speak to a whole bunch of developers at this year's PlayStation Partner Awards, which is an event that takes place in Japan, honoring a bunch of different developers and their games. There's like a Game of the Year type award, the Grand Award, and all these different awards that go around. So a lot of love gets spread around to a number of different games that might not see it in other areas of the world or at different parts of the year. And we're going to start off first with Capcom and Resident Evil 4. They got to sit down with the producer of Resident Evil 4, Yoshiaki Hirabayashi, as well as the game's director, Yasuhiro Anbo. And they were asked about the future of the Resident Evil franchise and how they plan to continue it. Mr. Hirabayashi responds by saying, "We have released 3 remake series, and we feel that they have been very well received, both for us and as people who love the previous games. We are very happy that people of today can play them, so we would like to continue this. I hope to be able to provide information about what we do in the future." And of course, the Resident Evil remakes, if you haven't played them, what are you doing? They're incredible. Resident Evil 2 remake's great. RE3 remake, not a bad game, but it could have been better. And then of course you have RE4 remake, which was incredibly well done, as well as its DLC Separate Ways. Tons of fun, so much added value. Capcom clearly knows how to do the remakes with the reimaginings, putting their own spin on it, and knowing what the fans want. They make these really great complete packages that just scream polish and quality and money. And speaking on continuing to do this, of course, there's been rumors that Resident Evil 5 will get a remake, but the remake I want to see from the Resident Evil franchise is Code Veronica. If there's any Resident Evil that would benefit the most from a remake, it's probably Code Veronica. It's super wacky and crazy. The story itself is all over the place. A lot of people don't really like certain aspects of that game. And in the second half of Code Veronica, you do basically repeat the stuff you did in the first half, but instead of playing as Claire, you're playing as Chris Redfield, so it gets a little bit repetitive and samey. But there's just something about that game that is so endlessly fun and charming, and it holds a special place in my heart. And if you could remake it today, you would have way better controls and combat, puzzles, exploration, and you could take characters from the original game that maybe didn't work all that well, like Steve, who was a big ol' nerd that a lot of people just didn't connect with, so when he has his big moment in the original, it doesn't really hit as hard. But you can take a character like him, rewrite him, and make him into this really cool character that has depth. And you see that with Resident Evil 3. They took the character of Carlos, who in the original, again, is kind of weird and cartoony, and they made him super cool in the remake. He's got a big role to play, and he's this cool action hero. And you can do the same thing for Steve, tighten up the gameplay, switch up some of the boss battles, and make this really awesome complete package that now fits in line with what they're doing with the Resident Evil remake series. I want it, a ton of fans want it. I'm crossing my fingers that they get to Code Veronica eventually, but based on some of the rumors flying around, it looks like they want to get to Resident Evil 5 before they do anything in regards to Code Veronica, which kind of sucks. But knowing that they're going to continue doing this, and if they can continue to output the games at the rate that they're doing while maintaining quality, I'm all for it. Now, moving on to Final Fantasy XVI, which actually received the Grand Award as well as the User's Choice Award. And I think the Grand Award is kind of like their version of the Game of the Year Award. So congratulations to Final Fantasy XVI and that team for getting that award. That's a pretty big thing. But here they got to sit down with Hiroshi Takai as well as Kazutoyo Maehiro and talk to them a little bit about Final Fantasy XVI and what we can expect with those DLCs. Takai goes on to say, "I can answer as much as I can," laughing. "These 2 episodes allow you to to learn more about the world of Final Fantasy XVI and allow you to experience the darkness and mystery of Clive's story. We also hope to deliver new powerful enemies and elements that will make the battles more enjoyable. Please look forward to it. And this sentiment has kind of got people mixed online. If you look on Twitter, again, this is just from what I'm seeing, a lot of people are pretty mixed. On the one hand, they're excited to go back and flesh out Clive's story more and get to experience some of the darker stuff, which I'm assuming is the Waloed stuff from when Clive was captured as a teenager to him being an adult. I think is probably what they're talking about here with the DLCs and what they're going to focus on. And then you do have some people who are kind of upset about this news because they felt that Clive's story was focused enough on in Final Fantasy XVI. You know, it was his game, it was a Clive-centric game to the point where some of the side characters who should have had more focus and had their time to shine took a back seat to Clive because, again, it was his story. So a lot of people were hoping that these DLCs would focus on things like maybe the Leviathan icon or characters like Jill or Dion or Cid or Benedicta or Barnabas and all these wonderful characters that could have been fleshed out more, because one of the critiques that I had about 16 was that the characters are solid, but I don't feel like they have a ton of development. And I think that the voice actors actually make up for a lot of that. They do a lot of the heavy lifting for these characters and bringing them to life and adding all this depth. And that was a critique I had of the main game, is that we learn about Clive, but a lot of what he experiences and makes him into the man that he is before he meets Jill, we don't know any of that. He just kind of talks about it very briefly. They glaze over it pretty quickly in the main game. So we never see those events that take place from when Clive's that teenager to being an adult to meeting Jill. All of that stuff is just a blank space right now, and we don't really know the details of it. We just know that Clive did a lot of bad things, he had a lot of bad things happen to him, and that's about it. So if the DLC is going to focus more on that era of Clive's life, it will be nice to get more info, but I kind of feel like maybe that should have been included in the main game from the get-go instead of being taken out and saved for DLC. But again, I don't know if that's what they did, if they did take that out of the main game and say, hey, we're going to save it for later, or if they just decided, you know, we never fleshed that out, let's go back and do that. But there's also another way to read that statement, the whole mystery of Clive's story with the darkness and mystery and all that. Just because they're going to focus on the darker parts of Clive's story doesn't mean that the DLC itself is going to be Clive-centric. You very well, again, could focus on the Waloed era of Clive's story. We know he doesn't run into people like Barnabas yet, but you could focus on Barnabas. You could focus on Benedicta and Cid in particular, in that kind of love triangle that goes on there, and flesh out those characters more. So it can kind of be an ensemble piece where, yeah, there are moments where we're playing as Clive and experiencing his story, but you can also have things shift away and focus on Cid and focus on Benedicta and Barnabas and really flesh those characters out more, because I don't think those characters were fleshed out enough in the main game, especially Barnabas. If I'm not mistaken, most of what you learn about Barnabas is either in the massive lore stuff you gotta read, or it's in the Ultimania that you have to buy separately and read about that to learn about who he is and what he's really been through. And then of course Benedicta was a character who was incredibly intriguing, but she's in the game for a cup of coffee and then she's gone. So learning more about her backstory and how she gets close to Cid and then eventually leaves him because of, you know, what Cid does, he leaves the Kingdom of Waloed. There's so much that you can explore that doesn't focus on Clive that I think a lot of people want to see. And of course, focusing on Dion would have been nice. I think Dion is probably the most compelling and interesting character in Final Fantasy XVI. I think his backstory, his character development, what he goes through, his ups and his downs are absolutely engaging and fascinating, and I think somewhere out there in the vast multiverse of Final Fantasy games, there's a Final Fantasy XVI where Dion is the lead and it's his game and it's his story. But either way, that's what they're going to be focusing on, that dark period of time that gets kind of glazed over in the main game of what Clive goes through, probably when he's a teenager to when he becomes that adult that then meets Jill as well as Cid. And then there's a quick little blurb here on immersion and difficulty, which I thought was really interesting. This comes from My Hero, and he says, we placed importance on immersing ourselves in the world view while playing. Once you hold the controller, our top priority is to make you feel immersed in the game, so you feel like you want to clear the game, and you never let go of the controller. As for the small details, we try not to introduce any stressful parts so that players would not leave the game unattended and move on to other games. Personally, that's another critique I had of 16, is I thought the game was just a little too easy. They kind of hold your hand during some fights. Some fights really aren't all that difficult. You do get a lot of potions that you can use to heal yourself. They're pretty forgiving when it comes to the dodge window for the evasion stuff, and then of course there's tons of accessibility stuff if you struggle with action games. And for me personally, I grew up playing action games, so I do have a bit of knowledge when it comes to how to play them, the mechanics and how they work, but I'm not necessarily good at them, if that makes any sense. For example, Devil May Cry 3, the original one. I never beat that growing up because it was just way above my skill level and way too difficult. So I'm familiar with the action games, but I'm not great at them, and even then I thought 16 was just way too easy. I think the only fight in that game that I struggled on was one of the optional fights, and I forget the name of the monster, but it's the big red ruby dragon that's basically a Dark Souls fight, because you're in this huge arena, he's got so many AoE attacks and projectiles, and because he's a dragon with a long neck, trying to hit him is a bit difficult, and sometimes your moves just don't land on him because of where that hitbox is at. But that was pretty much the only fight in the game where it's like, okay, this feels like a challenge, and I wanted more of that. I wanted harder bosses, higher difficulty levels, smarter enemies, more aggressive enemies, and I think having that available from the get-go in a hard mode would have been really nice and would have alleviated some of my complaints when it came to the game's difficulty. And last but not least, we move on to Crisis Core Reunion and the game's producer, Mariko Sato, and they ask her, is there anything important that people need to pay attention to in Crisis Core before they play Rebirth? She responds by saying the key point of Crisis Core is that it depicts the past stories of Zack, Sephiroth, and Cloud from FF7. I think if you experience Crisis Core and then play Rebirth, you will be able to experience what happened in the past in a fun way that makes you wonder if this is what happened. As those of you who have already played 7 Remake will know, there are some similarities and differences between the stories of 7 and Crisis Core. We want you to enjoy this mystery in 7 Rebirth, so please look forward to its release, which again, you know, if you play Crisis Core, spoiler alert for those who don't know, Crisis Core are the true events of what happened back in Nibelheim, what went down with Sephiroth and Cloud, and the events that Cloud retells in the original 7, as well as what we're going to see in 7 Rebirth, are unreliable. He's the unreliable narrator. He's speaking from a perspective and memories that are all jumbled up together, so he thinks he's telling the accurate story. But some characters like Tifa are like, okay, these things aren't necessarily adding up, you're missing some details or adding things in that shouldn't be there. So, and then you even throw back in the original FF7, there's so much in that original story with Zack and Cloud and Sephiroth that doesn't happen in Crisis Core. You know, characters like Genesis are later added in, and Jill, Lazard, all of these extra characters get thrown into Crisis Core that weren't in the original FF7. So it's kind of a cool way for people to experience the story of Nibelheim and that flashback and a character like Zack and what he goes through, because he's in the original FF7 very briefly and then he's gone. And then the last question is, they ask her what were specific things that they paid attention to bring Crisis Core from the past into the present. She responds by saying, also, I was thinking that this work would be playable by users who had played 7 Remake, so I was very particular about making sure that customers wouldn't feel out of place even if they were playing 7 Remake. I've adjusted it, which again, this is stuff we covered ages ago with my Crisis Core coverage and how they work to bring Crisis Core into the modern times, and really revamping that combat made a huge difference. In the OG Crisis Core, combat was fun at first, but then it got really repetitive and there was so much delay with your button presses and the attack button and your different hotbar abilities that it kind of became a chore to do the fights, and it kind of takes you out of the pacing of the game and wanting to learn more about the story. But in Reunion, they completely revamped that combat, and while it's not on the same level of something as 7 Remake, it is very close. It is so much faster. Zack has so much more mobility and attacks that he can do. He can dodge and cancel out of certain animations and get access to spells and attacks and abilities with shortcuts that are so much more faster and responsive than what we saw in the original Crisis Core, which just speeds up combat that much more. And it makes the original combat stuff, which was kind of a chore to get through, so much more fun. And now you're progressing through the game and you're getting into these fights and you want to finish the fights. You don't want to run away. You actually want to fight these guys and level up your materia and learn new abilities and upgrade the DMW bar. And the changes that they made and what she made were just incredible and really worked to bring Crisis Core as close to modern times and gameplay as they possibly could. That is the video. Again, it's a little bit long, so my apologies, but let me know in the comments down below what you guys think about these comments, especially in regards to the Final Fantasy XVI DLC. Are you kind of disappointed that they're going to focus on that darker part of Clive's story? And did you personally want to see it focus on other characters or maybe the icon Leviathan? I am Curious Corduroy. I will see you guys in the next video. Please remember to always be excellent to one another.